thank you very much for staying. It's not the most exciting title I've ever spoken to, what the data tells us. What I'm actually going to talk about is some of the fiscal challenges facing us over the next several years, something about what's happened to income and earnings, which I think really matters from HE finances, and also some of the work we've been doing on HE finances, some of it sponsored by UUK. That's broadly what I was asked to do. It's rather broad. I will try to get through it in sensible time. It's going to be inevitably skating over the top of a lot of work that we've done at the IFS. I will refer to some of our particular pieces of work as we go through. Please feel free to browse our website. Seeing Paul Boyle in the audience, I should of course thank the ESRC for funding a significant part of this as well. So I'll talk about the deficit and current public spending plans. That clearly sets the context for where funding for higher education will be coming in the next few years. And as I say, I'll talk a bit about incomes, earnings, and specifically graduate earnings, which underlie a lot of the issues in terms of student funding, and then a bit about student funding and the public finances. So let me start with the big picture. I'm sure you're all completely aware of this. We have a massive, great deficit. It's still very big even after 4 years of very substantial spending cuts, and most of what's there is judged to be structural. In other words, it won't go away just because the economy starts to grow, and that's why there's quite a lot of spending cuts to come. Actually, my judgment is that the real thing that can constrain government over the next several years, and that goes beyond 2020, is the size of the debt, which on Maastricht definitions, at about 90% of national income, is bigger than it's been at any time since, I think, the early 1960s, when the debt from the war started to go away. So there's still a long way to go on reducing the deficit, and whichever party wins the election, they're going to have a big job to do. And this chart really illustrates that. In terms of national income, it's a 10% tightening. That's £150 billion. If you think of national income as £1.5 trillion, so that's the number I just talked about. And we're about halfway there. In fact, in terms of the spending cuts, which are the red bits on here, and if the government continues to focus on spending cuts in the way certainly the Conservative half of it have said that they will, we're nowhere near halfway through the spending cuts yet. Now, where does that take us? If we follow the plan set out in the Budget 2014 book, where will we be? So the red line there is spending as a proportion of national income. The blue line is tax receipts as a proportion of national income. You can see a great big gap there at the point of the crisis, and then narrowing a bit over the last 3 or 4 years. This is what the red book tells us will happen. It will close nicely. The red line will go nicely down quite sharply. The blue line very slightly up as we get a little bit of a rebound in tax receipts. But I think the key thing to note about that is after what will by then be a decade of spending cuts, spending will still be at the same proportion of national income as it was in the mid-2000s, halfway through the last government's second term. So where we're not going is to a world in which total spending will be at a dramatically low level relative to national income, and nor will we be in a place where tax is at a dramatically low level relative to national income. Tax there will be at its highest level since 1997. That, in one sense, if you were on the Conservative side of the political spectrum, would be your explanation for wanting to do all of this through spending cuts. It gets you back to at least since a long-run average in tax and spending, at least since the mid-80s. If you go further back, both tax and spending were rather higher as a proportion of national income. So that's the plan. So what I've showed you so far is spending as a proportion of national income. What you might think you might want to think about is spending in real pounds billion terms. And what I'm going to do here is break it down a bit to explain where the cuts are coming from. And the first and surprising line in a sense, is this, which is showing total spending, all government spending, in constant pounds billion terms. Now, what you see there is actually over a 10-year or 8-year period, a relatively small cut. 30 billion or 4% over 8 years is very, very small. So why is everyone talking about these massive spending cuts? And breaking that down, I think, helps understand the choices that the government is making and actually where higher education and other spending sits within that. So to explain again, the previous chart was showing things as a proportion of national income. This is just showing it in real pounds billion terms. So not very much in the way of cuts there, it looks. Well, why is that? Well, partly, of course, spending on debt interest is going up, even with very, very low levels of interest rates. Debt interest is going up because the level of debt is shooting up. So what we might be more interested in is actually that 8% cut, 50 billion cut over that period in non-debt interest spending. Debt interest doesn't buy you anything very useful. So what's going on there? So 8%, again, doesn't sound like a massive number. Well, within that, there's quite a big increase in spending on social security. That's largely pensions, though not just pensions, despite the cuts in other aspects of social security, though that number isn't going down. But pension spending is going up quite fast over this period, largely because the number of people over 65 is increasing by 2 million or 20% over this 10-year period. Aging is with us, and it is having a significant effect on the budget at the moment. So once you take that out of the equation, then you've got a 14% cut on public services. So everything else, 14% down over that period, about 70 billion pounds. But even then, that's not all the story. So you've got that 70 billion pounds cut in public services, but actually departmental spending, a bigger cut. Why have you got that bigger cut in departmental spending than overall public services? Well, again, it's largely pensions that are to blame. Public service pension spending is going up really fast over this period and squeezing other departmental spending. So the headline number for departmental spending over this period is, on average, a 20% cut in departmental spending just in real pounds terms. And that's where the big numbers start to really come from. So you've got a very small cut in total spending, but in departmental spending, the stuff that you no doubt are most worried about is a 20% cut. And that's where it all comes from. I should add, if you then layer in the fact that the health service is being protected, and that schools are being protected, and that overseas aid is being protected, then the average cut over that period for other departments is about 36%. The average cut is about 36%. And BIS sits very much in the middle of that average group. So that's the scale of the change. Because so many bits of spending are going up or being protected, the rest, and I'm afraid HE is in the rest, is being cut on average by about a third. So everything I've showed you there is based on what the Budget Red Book says, and in particular what the Conservatives say they want to do. Is there any difference between the parties? Well, it doesn't look like it on the face of it. So Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, has said the next Labour government will balance the books and deliver a surplus on the current budget over the next Parliament. And Mr Osborne has said he will deliver balance or surplus on the budget over that Parliament. That word current is actually rather important, because the Chancellor has said overall balance or surplus, but Mr Balls only wants balance or surplus on the current budget. That's a difference of around 28 billion. So what does that mean? It means that the Labour Party, if they follow that particular rule, could be spending 28 billion a year more in 2018 than could the Conservatives if they got into returned to office. And 28 billion is quite a big number if you just put it into the unprotected bits of public services. You could obviously, of course, reduce taxes, put spending wherever you want, but if you just put that into the unprotected bits of public services instead of something like, I don't know if I've got that on the next chart, yes, instead of something like 10% additional cuts, average departmental spending, you get 2.5%, and unprotected departments going down 5% rather than 19%. So the difference between the Labour Party stated objective and the Conservative Party stated objective in terms of what that might give for public spending, and particularly in unprotected departments, is really quite substantial. That's not to say even what Labour is suggesting is going to be easy on top of the cuts that have already occurred. And I'm certainly not suggesting that all of the money that they are suggesting that they might have available, A, they would use, or B, they would spend on departmental spending, or C, that they would put into unprotected departments. But that gives you some sense of the set of trade-offs that may be possible according to who wins the next election and which way they go on their fiscal rules. Of course, there is one big trade-off here, which is if you do what Mr. Balls wants to do, then you have a somewhat bigger deficit and a bigger national debt at the end of this period than would be the case if you did what Mr. Osborne wants to do. And if you then carry that on, the impact on debt in the long run is actually quite significant. And that, of course, is the trade-off and ought to be the stuff of the next political election campaign. Ought to be the stuff of the election campaign, this trade-off between the level of cuts that you want and the level of deficit you're going to have at the end. I suspect we won't get anything quite that rational. So I could, of course, go on and on and on about the fiscal situation. The broad story, I think, is fairly straightforward. A lot of cuts have happened, significantly more to come. As I say, some difference between the parties. But let me move on to theme 2 of the talk, and that's about what the opposition is calling the cost of living crisis, what is actually about what's happening to incomes, and in particular what's happening to earnings. And that's where I think this is particularly relevant to you. I mean, the first point, of course, to make is that real incomes, after you adjust for inflation, are still well below their pre-recession peak, about 8.5% at the mean, 6% at the median. What you will see from that is that actually the distribution has compressed over this period. This has not been a widening in the income distribution. There's been a compression in the income distribution over this period because earnings are the bit of income that have been hit the hardest, and obviously it's better off people who have earnings. It's driven by this fall in real earnings. So if you look at a period between 2009 and 2012, which is the stuff where we've got really good data, but actually it's pretty much the same up till now because earnings have not recovered at all, nearly a 10% fall in real pre-tax earnings over that period. And that's despite higher employment. So that's the amount that each household gets. So again, if you look at average hourly earnings, they've fallen by a similar kind of amount in real terms. Now, in one sense, we shouldn't be as surprised by this as we sometimes are, given what's happened to national income. Now, you will have heard that national income is now back where it was pre-recession, but there are about 2 million more of us, so national income per head is still actually a fair bit down on where it was pre-recession. Actually, national income per head, you think, might matter, and indeed it certainly does matter in terms of what it flows through to in terms of incomes and earnings. Now, again, I could spend a lot of time talking about what's driving this and the productivity puzzle and so on, but let me that's just illustrating the fall in incomes. But let me take two particular aspects of this. The first is just to say that this has really been significantly concentrated on the younger age groups. Younger age groups have done a lot worse than older age groups, and particularly 22 to 30-year-olds. So let me illustrate this. This is a measure of income. What's happened to real incomes of 22 to 30-year-olds, you'll see there over that period something like 15% cut in their real incomes. The real incomes of the older group, 31 to 59, that's more like, what's that, about a 7% cut, about half as much. If you look at the over 59s, no cut at all. In fact, their incomes have continued to rise over this period. So this has been if you look at the 1980s recession, what you see is the rich pulling away from the poor. What you see in this recession is the old pulling away from the young. Really quite different in its pattern in terms of household incomes. So that's one measure of income. I'm going to show you another one which shows the same kind of pattern. This is after you take account of housing costs. So if you take income and then take rent or mortgage payments off, you see a 20% fall for the young and about a 10% fall for those over the age of 30. So again, really big difference in the effect on living standards of these groups. And obviously, it's your students moving into that 22 to 30 year old age group who are going to be experiencing those very much lower levels of incomes than their predecessors. So let me illustrate that again. Thinking about different groups of people, thinking about them by cohort. So individuals born in the mid-1980s, so graduating maybe 10 years ago or so, their incomes 10% lower than those who were born 5 years earlier, 6% lower than those born 10 years earlier, about the same as those born 15 years earlier. And that's on average the income earnings for those groups. Now, that's extraordinary because, as you know, on average, each cohort gets a bit better off than the one before it. So each group of people hitting 25 tend to be better off than the cohort before. To be still essentially the same as that group born 15 years ago, and actually significantly worse off than those born 5 or 10 years ago, is pretty much unprecedented. And that is despite the fact that this younger cohort is better educated, or at least more of them have been through university, and their incomes are nevertheless significantly lower. And we've had this big increase, as I'm sure you're aware, in the numbers who are graduates over this period. So let me illustrate this, and this is now just those with a degree. So take the cohort born in period 1968 to 1972, so these guys are in their early to mid-40s now, mid-40s. This is what their incomes were from age, or their earnings rather, weekly earnings on the vertical axis, from age 24 through to age 30. So obviously they grow as they get older, rising to about £650 a week on average by the age of 30. And then, as you'd expect, the next cohort, those born in the early to mid-1970s, their earnings are a bit higher over that period. For those born at the end of the 1970s, so they're in their mid-30s by now, well, over the first bit of that period, not very much difference. So actually, by the end of the period, this is graduates, their earnings are a bit lower than those born 10 years beforehand. You can't see the blue line very well. That's the latest cohort we have data on, those born in the mid-1980s. And actually, that blue line is below the other lines. And essentially, these guys, by the age of 25, are earning, as I said, about the same as those born 15 or indeed 20 years earlier. Incredible change. So let me repeat that. The average graduate now in their 20s is earning no more than the average graduate 20 years ago at the same age. Now, of course, a large part of what's driving that is the composition of graduates. There are a lot more graduates, and so you've got a lot more of the lower earning graduates. The gap between graduates and non-graduates has maintained. It is still worth being a graduate relative to a non-graduate because the gap between the earnings of graduates and non-graduates hasn't gone down, but the average earnings of graduates have not risen in 20 years. And that's absolutely astonishing statistic in my view. All of which matters not just to students and graduates, but it matters enormously to higher education funding. And that's the last part that I'm now going to come on to. So I'm going to show you a few facts and charts based on a couple of pieces of work that you see quoted there. There are other pieces of work which we've also done on this. Again, do refer to what we've done on the IFS website to look at that. So, student loan. So, let's a couple of things about HE funding. Student loans have already added 3% of national income to the national debt. 3% of national income to national debt. That's a lot. That's 45 billion added to the national debt already by student loans. And let me just illustrate some of the reasons for that. So this shows you from 1990 through to 2015 the annual value of loans made to higher education students. And as you can see, there are different kinds of loans according to when they were given. But as you can see, that annual value has risen gradually over that period, but it stands at about 12 billion a year going out in loans by 2015. So about 12 billion of additional loans to each cohort of students from 2015 onwards, and after 2015 that will flatten off at about 12 billion of loans. So that's money from the government to students which they will then pay back. It's a big number, 12 billion, even in Treasury terms. What does that mean? Well, take one cohort, take the cohort coming in to university in 2012. You see the red line, that's the additional effect they have on national debt. So that just that one cohort will add £12 billion of national debt by the time they graduate. And then that red line, you'll see how that gradually, but only very gradually, falls over a long period through about 2050. It's still about £6 billion by 2050 because, of course, a lot of this doesn't get paid back. That tiny little black bars underneath the horizontal line is what students are paying back, or what graduates are paying back over time. That's what the flow of income for one cohort of students looks like. Now, part of that, of course, is to what I'm sure you're all familiar with, the RAB charge, the proportion of money that actually gets paid, that's given to a student that gets paid back. Now, this is where what I was saying about earnings becomes very important. The estimated RAB charge has grown really significantly over the last 4 years because of what's been happening to earnings, with the point at which you start paying back fixed at 21,000. Earnings are much lower than was expected at the time, so quite a lot less will at the end get paid back. And just to illustrate that, and also actually to illustrate how progressive the system is, if you take all graduates, we reckon this is IFS calculations, we reckon the average RAB charge, this is just for full-time undergraduates, about 43%. So total taxpayer contribution per student, that's not per year, but per student over their usual 3-year course, about £24,000 for all graduates. For those who end up doing badly in the labour market, the RAB charge is near enough 100%. They don't pay anything back. An average taxpayer contribution of about 44,000. If you look at the highest earners, as almost a zero RAB charge, they do pay it all back, but there is some additional costs associated with the interest rate, but also where there are additional teaching grants and so on. So the average taxpayer contribution to students is about 8,000. So again, that's the scale of the costs associated with student loans, and why you get that 12 billion cost first off, and then that very gradual move to still a 6 billion additional to debt for each cohort of students. How does all that work for graduates? Well, of course, the first thing it does is it effectively adds 9% to the marginal tax rate, and actually you can think about this as a tax for about 3/4 of students who will never pay it back. So if you're one of those students who'll never pay it back, this is just an additional 9% of your tax. You keep paying 9% of your tax for 35 years, and then you stop paying 9% of your tax. It's not a debt that you will ever pay down. And therefore, if you're pretty sure, actually, that you're not going to be one of those people paying it back, you'll probably respond to it like you would respond to an increase in your tax rate, to the extent that that may have an effect on your labour supply or other behaviour. So just to illustrate, here's your earnings across the horizontal axis, the tax payment schedule on the vertical axis, standard national insurance and income tax system. You're at 32% across most of that period, 42% once you're a high rate taxpayer. But sorry, that doesn't come out very well. Obviously, if you add the 9% student loans on top, you've actually got a 51% tax rate for people over the higher rate tax bracket. So we've got rid of the 50% tax rate on people over £150,000, but there is what I would describe as a tax rate of 51% on people in that area as a result of the student loan system. So what's the effect of all of that? And this is partly some work we've been doing with UUK. It raises repayments, and it raises them especially at later ages. So this is showing age of the graduates. This is showing on the vertical axis, it's showing the amount that you pay back each year. This is mean repayments. The light green is the old system that the current system replaced. The dark green is the new system. What you see actually is the new system is pretty generous, pretty kind to people in their 20s, but significant levels of repayments all the way through to 50, and much higher levels than you got under the old system. One of those is the mean, the other's the median. As I said, payments are less until you get to 30, but the yellow line's much higher at 40, so the yellow line that goes up quickly, that's showing for those with the lowest earnings, those with the highest earnings, the amount that they're paying back at age 40. So those in the top couple of deciles of earnings at age 40 will be paying back about £3,000 a year. The average, the very top group, is a bit less than the one below because some of them will have paid it all off by then. But again, you can see there's very progressive flavour to the new system relative to the old system, the sort of darker yellow line at 40, where it's actually the lower earners who are paying back more by the time they get to 40, because the higher earners will have paid it all back by that. Sorry, that was a very quick run through an awful lot of stuff. I hope that's brought together some of what we do on public finances and debt and deficits, what's happening to incomes, which I think is the most dramatic thing which is actually happening to UK at the moment, and then how that's affected the student loan system and the effect that that has, significantly increasing public debt, but also significantly reducing, of course, the future incomes of those students who are affected. Thank you.